Good evening. Good evening to all of you. I am Dr. Ramona Tascoe, a graduate of UCSF School of Medicine, 1979. And it is my distinct honor to be the interviewer and host for this evening. We are so proud to have with us one of our graduate alumni, Dr. Rupa Marya, who I've known as Rupa, and many of you may know her as Rupa as well. She's a magnificent physician, but she's even greater, a magnificent human being who's found a way to juggle activism and scientific research with social justice and healthcare science and research. She's wrote a magnificent book. We're going to bring you into her head, into her spirit today, and then we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions and pierce the veil of what you don't know. She promises to be candid. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to ask you all to pay attention to the pathway for asking questions. You're going to go to the Q&A box in your browser or in your Zoom and type out your questions. Someone will be monitoring and we'll be able to get right to your questions. Let me tell you a little bit about the audience size. We have close to, if not more than 200 people with us today. The majority are UCSF alumni from all schools within our university. We have faculty, we have staff, we have nurses, we have healthcare providers in all subdivisions of medicine who want to know more about this magnificent book. What is it called? I know you're all on the other side. She doesn't know what the name of it. It's called Inflamed. Inflamed. And if it was about a book, if it was a book about something other than healthcare, we would wonder, we would think it was about somebody angry, just outdone with something that happened in life. Dr. Marya Rupa is going to explain to us how she came up with that title, if it is as concrete as it seems to be, and what does it actually apply to on a broader scale. Dr. Rupa, can you hear me?
I can.
Well, you published this wonderful book in 2021, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice, the subtitle. And you perform in this book as a political ecologist, along with your co-author. Tell us a little bit about your book. Tell us what was the intent and what do you want us to take from it? And then you and I are going to have some interactive conversation and bring the audience in.
Thank you so much, Ramona. It's such an honor to be here with you in particular. I admire you so much in what you do and how you roll and who you are as a physician, as a scientist, as a community member, as an elder. I just want to say I'm speaking to you today from the occupied and unceded homelands of the Ramona Tascoe people. I was born and raised here I'm actually sitting in my mother's house in what is now called Los Altos. I was born and raised in this area, and I have been so grateful to be working as a doctor in this area at UCSF for now. It's been 20 years since I came as an intern in 2002. And through my noticings of, what I saw at the bedside in countless hospital encounters, and then what I would notice when I would travel around the world with my bands. I'm also a composer and a musician, and ended up creating a path in medicine that balanced my work as a physician and as an artist. Through investigating with music in different communities, the intersection between society and health, I started to see, different kinds of burdens of disease in different kinds of populations. And when you travel to communities with your guitar instead of with a stethoscope and a research pad, you get a different kind of entry. People let you into their homes. People share their songs and their stories and their histories in a different way than if I was going as a doctor to investigate the social determinants of health. And so this gave me a very deep and layered understanding of how history and power were sedimenting in bodies in different ways. And that's what led me to look at, the subject of the book, which is about inflammation of our bodies, inflammation of our societies, and inflammation of the planet, and what was causing this inflammation. And so as I toured around the world and come back home, and like I'd be there in San Francisco, I remember as a resident and seeing, young people with emphysema coming from Bayview Hunters Point and being like, okay, so how many packs of cigarettes do you smoke? And they're like, I don't smoke. Well, how many people smoke in your household? No one smokes in my household. How much secondhand smoke are you around? I'm around no secondhand smoke. What's going on with this young Black person who has no smoking history coming in with emphysema? And then seeing patient after patient like that and being like, okay, what's going on? Like, why is this happening? Why is this inflammation existing in this person's lungs in this way, in their bodies in this way? And I started to think of it as a syndrome of colonized people who were most impacted through colonial structures, because I was noticing the same patterns in Ireland, the same patterns in India, the same patterns in the indigenous communities I would visit and work with in Mexico and throughout the United States. And then over the years, what we've come to learn is that all of these diseases that I was noticing that, we call syndrome, metabolic syndrome, or that these things are all diseases that have where chronic inflammation is playing a role in the pathogenesis of these diseases. And so I'm just going to share some slides because I think it will help our audience look at, this idea of inflammation. So what we talk about in our book, Inflamed, is what we call a higher order of diagnosis, the way we'd been trained through a colonial mindset of medicine. So medicine was part of the trifecta of conquering lands in the 1700s, 1800s, that, it was missionaries, medics, and militaries that went to around the world to, spread these concepts and these ideas that came during the Enlightenment that really structured the way we understand disease today, and that we're still working within this framework of these errors of thought that persist in our science and limit us in how we're able to understand the phenomena that we're seeing today. When we look at the systems level derangements of pandemic or climate change, these systems level derangements are coming from systems level interactions. And our diagnosis has been limited through thinking of individuals or even individual populations and not looking at how systems harmonize or are dissonant with each other. And so what we expound in our book is a higher order of diagnosis, one that incorporates history and power to look at how systems are interacting, systems of ecologies, systems of economies, systems of oppression, axes of oppression. And like with every story, and that's what a diagnosis, is told as a story, the history of present illness, it starts with a time and a place. And the time and the place that we look at in our book is the birth and dawn of colonial capitalism, and how the mindset that was necessary to justify the stealing of land and labor of peoples around the world set up these architectures of supremacy, these axes of domination that have eventually, led to a lot of trauma and inflammation in people's bodies and in our world around us. When Raj and I look at inflammation, we look at it, as in a metaphorical way. Yes, the forests are on fire and we can't breathe for about 6 weeks a year now in California. But it's also a sign of damage. And what this graph shows is how the damage is happening. And when we think about, colonialism, critical relationships between peoples and between humans and the entire web of life were severed in order to advance this economic agenda, this power agenda. And through the severance of those critical relationships, we experience inflammation. And when we think about inflammation, we have to remember that this is an evolutionarily conserved response of the innate immune system to damage or the threat of damage. So when you get a paper cut, In an acute inflammatory response, the cells send distress signals, SOS signals, and that those distress signals mobilize all the cellular and biochemical resources needed to heal that wound. So the inflammatory response is a healing response. And when that wound is healed, the inflammatory response goes quiet. So it's the way that the body restores homeostasis. But what happens when the damage signals keep coming? And when those damage signals keep coming, what we're seeing is that those SOS signals don't stop, and that the inflammatory response then ends up creating collateral damage. It ends up being like a fire that smolders in the body. And what was once a healing response has turned into a harming response in the body. And this is important because when we look at chronic inflammatory diseases, all the ones that we treat as like a hospital medicine doctor, I work in the division of hospital medicine, the bulk of the diseases I see, whether it's cancer or dementia or cardiovascular disease or stroke or even severe COVID, these are diseases where inflammation is playing a major role. And when it comes to chronic inflammatory diseases, the exposome, which is the sum of all of our lifetime exposures from conception onward, is more predictive of the development of chronic inflammatory disease than our genome. But most of our science, if you look at most of the dollars from the NIH, is going to genetic research. Because when you focus on individuals and genes, you don't have to see how history and structures of power are continuing to predetermine people's development of these diseases. So why is diabetes rising all over the world? Why is inflammatory bowel disease rising? Why is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease now the leading cause of liver failure in the United States, surpassing even alcoholic liver disease? And it's because the exposome that has been constructed through colonial capitalism is predetermining this kind of immune response from different populations. What was so striking to me in the research was to see that the exposome not only consists of the things we think of as the structural determinants of health, what we see in our EPIC, structural determinants of health, on the computer. It's, do you drink? Do you smoke? Do you have access to food? Yes, these are important, but, it doesn't ask like, why is someone drinking that much? Why are they driven to smoke that much? What is it about their current social reality that makes smoking and drinking or a substance use disorder the way in which they are managing and coping with their reality? It also includes history. So intergenerational trauma, that is part of the exposome. It includes structures of power. So whether you're in a neighborhood that's being subjected to racist police violence, it includes our stories. So the stories that children are told as whether or not the police are there to help them or to harm them ends up shaping their telomeres, how long their telomeres are. Their bodies are responding to these stories. And it also is shaped by our cosmologies are an important part of the exposome. So our understanding of who we are in the place of the universe, what is the meaning of ourselves and our communities in the place of the world and the universe. It was fascinating to me to see that Indigenous communities in Canada who retained their cultural knowledge, their language, were protected against the development of diabetes and also against youth suicide. And these are both conditions where inflammation is playing a role. So how is, your sense of speaking a language and knowing who you are in the world, interacting with your cells in a way that will either manifest an inflammatory disease or not, or protect you? And so that was something that Raj and I looked at. This is not what I'm going to share now is culminating, 3 years of reading all the references that we cite, all the very exhaustive peer-reviewed literature that we cite in the book. But this is putting it together in a way that it hasn't been put together yet, which is drawing the connections between what is happening in the exposome and what's happening on the cellular level. And what we know is that in every replicating cell of the body, and besides our germline cells or our somatic cells that replicate, when there is exposure to when there is this toxic exposome, so this daily activities where you're going to be, encountering these things, These impacts are damaging the cell in very specific ways through oxidative stress, through changes in the DNA, through mitochondrial dysfunction, through telomere erosion. And so when you get an accumulation of this damage in a replicating cell, these cells enter an early aging, an early senescence. They go through a cell cycle arrest. And prematurely aged cells that have been aged through damage end up remodeling their chromatin and taking on a phenotype called the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. And these SASP cells that can exist in all these tissues in our body, so they can exist in the kidney and cause kidney fibrosis. They can exist in the liver and cause liver fibrosis. They create microclimates of inflammation in the tissues, as well as expound these cytokines throughout our bodies. And this is what we see as chronic sterile inflammation. Right now, the science is not, we have these like markers, but it's not as tailored or as specific as it can be and as it will be, as we see where the science is going. But this to me is fascinating because it shows how, as you grow older, you accumulate these cells. So people who are getting these toxic exposures in their youth, so you look at children with adverse childhood events, they are going to accumulate more of these cells as they grow older. And they're going to consequently be expressing more of these diseases. So we found these SASP cells in all of these diseases in the body that we treat, including, again, like I said, severe COVID. And so if that is the case, that our bodies are responding, our cells are responding like this, it really moves the locus of pathology away from the individual into the structures of the exposome. So if the immune system is not out there fighting self versus other, but rather harmonizing to the exposome, if we have an exposome that is toxic, it will continue to manifest as inflammation in the body. If we have people who are chronically socially oppressed, as Black and Indigenous people and Latino people are in this country, you're going to see much more baseline inflammation. Then you add something like COVID to that, and you're going to get a raging wildfire. And that's exactly what we see in those communities who disproportionately are expressing severe COVID. And so if that is the case, then our work as physicians must be to simultaneously understand that we are treating individuals. But if we're not also understanding that the disease is existing in the exposome, the pathology is in the exposome, then we would be remiss if we're not also moving our attention there to restructure the exposome so that health might be possible. And so that's the central thesis of where this is at in our bodies, why this is important to understand in our bodies. And then we also go on to look at how this is analogous and consonant with those relationships to the earth and the web of life that have been ruptured through the same thought processes, that have the same will to power, that has sundered so much biodiversity and health of our entire ecosystem. And so that is, gosh.
Well, Rupa, you don't disappoint. And I'm certain that our audience has to be as dazzled as I am. It doesn't matter how many times I hear the explanation, I'm more compelled by the brilliance of the breakthrough. This book has been incredibly well researched. Almost 30% of the book is peer-reviewed references. And I'm curious, have you presented any of this to our alma mater? And how have they received it?
Oh, I was so grateful to be invited to give a grand rounds to the Department of Pediatrics. And I had a whole host of residents come down to this farm. So if we are working, if we're saying that the exposome is toxic, so we have to restructure it, the restructuring of the exposome is what Raj and I talk about as deep medicine. So the medicine that we practice that focuses on individuals without seeing the systems is what we call colonial medicine. It actually atomizes people, keeps the system separate, invisibilizes the lines of power. And deep medicine is engages with the exposome. And so what we're doing is working to get land back to Ramatush Indigenous people And I had about 30 residents from the pediatrics department come down to the farm, hear my grand rounds the first day and come down to the farm and work with us the next day. And it was so beautiful. And the School of Nursing had me give a talk to 300 of their students. It was met, I have never received such accolades. But the Department of Medicine, disappointingly doesn't feel like the book is up to the peer review of what they want to present for their grand rounds, which is unfortunate, because I think it's a real opportunity to see levels of connection, especially at this moment when we're experiencing both pandemic and climate change, systems level failures. We don't have enough analyses that bridge and connect these phenomenon that are happening right now that are becoming an issue for all of us who practice medicine.
At the risk of seeming cynical, do you think that there will ever be enough research to make that bridge viable and usable for the powers that be in medical institutions such as ours?
Well, I think that this is where the young brilliance of scientists is so critical. So the scientists, the basic scientists who've reviewed my book, both as peer reviewers, some of them there at UCSF, some at MIT, also people who've just reached out to me who've read the book, who are researchers in immunology, researchers in endocrinology and rheumatology, in the microbiome sciences, have reached out and just said, this is where the science has to go. They're very, very excited because I think also they've been trained to think very much going inside and not reaching outwards. And that is not what if you look at even microbiome science, that's not what the science is showing us. The science is showing us that the limited ways of thinking from the Enlightenment, which persist in modern medical education, are insufficient at containing the explanatory power of what we're witnessing today. That microbiome science is forcing us to become ecologists as health workers, that we have to understand how different disciplines of science and knowing, not just from ecology, but from social science, but from indigenous wisdom, that there are all these ways of knowing that need to be let in, that the knowers have to be expanded, that the peers have to be expanded. And that is not the way that, medical power medicine has approached the power of who is a knower. And I think about this when I wanted to bring in Tiny Gray Garcia, who is a formerly unhoused, brilliant poet in East Oakland, building poor people-led solutions to homelessness with other formerly unhoused people. They've literally built their own houses. And she does a lot of work around poverty scholarship, the lived experience of poor people. And she is one of my great teachers. And I said, we should bring in, I brought some med school students to learn from her. They were blown away. I'm like, this should be part of our training and understanding if we're serving unhoused populations, if we're serving poor people, to hear from actually an expert in the experience of being poor. And I was met with, this isn't pure, she's not a peer-reviewed academic. But I'm like, well, yes, she is, because those are her peers, right? And so when we think of, who is the knower and who gets to teach, that's a very powerful dynamic of
do we have agency over our thoughts and our lived experience? And do we have an audience? And has anyone anointed us to speak our truth to power? It reminds me of the question going back to microbiomes, deep medicine versus colonialized or colonized medicine. The science seems to be well proven, as you've spoken it, and you laid it out with some beautiful slides. Is it just a lack of will to change that keeps our institution and others like it from embracing this deep medicine concept and beginning to build a bridge to a whole new lived experience?
I think there is a lack of will to change in a substantive way. I think there are opportunities that have been moved forward to incrementally move the needle, but not a transformative, like, should we be rethinking what science is and who are the knowers of science and how we do science, and in which ways science should be advanced, and who has the right to be, talking about certain kinds of issues and things, and who are the experts? Are physicians always the experts? No, they're not. And so, and that brings up a lot of questions, especially right now in the era of, like, everyone wants to be a career anti-racism person, right? But how much have they been out in the community working with the folks at Bayview Hunters Point, making sure they're not being poisoned by radioactive waste, right? So how much of an anti-racist are you? And that becomes a question of power, right? And so to challenge the dynamics of power is actually critical in this issue of advancing science.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what's exciting is seeing and meeting the scientists there within the institution and outside the institution who are pushing that and really understand that this is about contours of power, and how do we demand that there are more ways of knowing let in, to make a much more complex and rich understanding of what we are seeing, because yeah,
please,
sorry.
Rupa, social science has had the luxury of wiggle room. It was Frantz Fanon who once said that the revolution was not going to be about race, it was going to be about class. If we take that and validate it and extrapolate from it a message that class can vary only to some extent. There are the outliers who can cross over to the opposite end of the bell curve. But generally, someone's got to be on the bottom and someone's got to be on the top. To what extent has our own medical institution and others like it decided that in order for us to stay at the top, we have to continue to invest in the model of science that has worked for us? We're not ready to divest from that and try something different. We might lose our place in line.
Yeah, or
do they have a vested interest?
Yeah, we might lose our NIH funding. Like, that's what that turns, right? That goes down to dollars, and who is funding science and how those allocations and decisions are being made. And I think that those are really important considerations. And I think that, to truly, Fanon also recognized that the hospital can't be decolonized, right? He walked away from it because he recognized that the doctor will always be the landowner, going back to class, that the doctor will always be part of the oppressive class. Mm-hmm. And that we must remain skeptical. And that's why I think that any sort of revolutionary work in medicine has to be led from other people. And that doctors' work is really to follow the lead of those who've actually been most impacted by the violence of the system, even within the hospital. And when I look at that, at UCSF, I think of all the low-wage workers. If you ask them, how would we restructure a healthcare system to be just and equitable? They're never at the anti-racism panels. They're never at the, grand rounds talking about that. It's always doctors. So those of us who've been anointed, who aren't going to rock the boat on those, on those very dynamics that you just pointed to, which are dynamics of class. That is really an important thing. And in the United States, class is always tied to race. It's always, it's a racial capitalist society. It's not only tied to race. And that was, an interesting part of the, visionary work of the Black Panthers movement, is working with poor white folks in Appalachia, is like knowing that the struggles, there are places to intersect in these struggles and to work together to build solidarity.
Mm-hmm. We had an interesting question pre-submitted. Do you think it might be more accurate to name the great disparity as one between the very rich and the poor, rather than against a particular race? Is there a risk of dividing and conquering? the poor when using phrases like Black Lives Matter, as opposed to Poor People Lives Matter. And I put this question out here before we actually go into the Q&A because it probably resonates with our audience as they're listening to us, because we can easily go into this question and spend the next 2 hours, but touch on it a little bit for us. Your work and that which you so eloquently have proven in your book clearly ties not only to race, but it also ties to class. Should they be in competition with each other? Talk to us.
I think they are axes of power that intersect. I don't think that, you can, when you look at the Buffalo shooter who just went in and shot up a bunch of Black folks, he wasn't like, well, I'm going to shoot the wealthy Black folks, not the poor Black folks. So that, we have to get, real about the kinds of violences that we're seeing, and also the way in which power is circumscribed. So no, I'm not one of these people who are like, oh, let's abandon race and not think about it. Let's just, focus on class. And I don't think it's an either or. I think there's a complex ways in which power intersects and works together. And I think that absolutely, we have to work across these lines and not let them divide us. And I'll say a story from the introduction of the book. I introduced a patient, actually, many people at UCSF took care of. I got the permission to talk about her story. Shelia McCarley. I think every clinician I know at UCSF met her in the ICU. She came to the hospital in her 50s, or maybe 60s, early 60s, where she had been born and raised in Alabama and then came to California in her 40s. Her hair started falling out, malar rash, joint swelled. They're like, oh, you have lupus. And then by the time she came to UCSF, she'd been in the hospital for 5 months with this inflammation. She was like, had SIRS basically, and no one could figure out, was it a bacteria? What was going on? Was it lupus? Was it some weird, hematologic thing? Couldn't figure it out. And she went in and out of the ICU, put on pressors, put on antibiotics, out of the ICU, in and out. I met her the last 2 weeks of her life. And, and it was a mystery. She was a mystery. And when her son walked in, he was in his 30s, tall, gaunt, with white supremacist tattoos around his eyes. I was like, okay, let me sit down and talk to these people. So I sat down and was like, what is your life like in Alabama? Tell me where you're from. Where did you grow up? What was it like? And out came this whole story about living in the Muscle Shoals district area, pulling catfish from the river that had a chlorine plant that was missing 150,000 pounds of mercury every year into the water. The same Tennessee River Valley watershed has 3M factories with the PFAS and all that, those forever chemicals going into the water. And I was just listening to this and how she drank that groundwater and how she ate the catfish. And her son said to me, all these people are dying in their 40s and 50s, and everyone keeps telling us it's cancer, but no one really knows what it is. And I stepped out of the room and was walking out of the ICU, and he followed me. And he just collapsed in my arms crying. And he said, nobody has ever bothered to ask us what our lives are like. Do you realize you're the first person to ask us what our lives are like? And that to me was like, oh my God, that's the medicine right there. That, I could have looked at this person with the hate on his face and just written him off. But I took that time to sit, and that's what medicine is so powerful, our jobs as clinicians, because we have that great privilege of sitting beyond the skin, sitting beyond our identities and learning from each other. And, that experience with that patient really propelled me to write the book. Because I'm like, what we found with her was just IL-6 that no one's ever seen. Her like macrophages completely replaced every part of her body. When we ended up doing an autopsy, she ended up passing. And that to me was absolutely, we need to not lose our empathy for one another. We absolutely must not lose our empathy for one another, as we're in a system that cultivates scarcity to coerce our participation in labor, And in that scarcity, we become pitted against each other. And that's a great disservice to the health of the whole system.
I'm reminded of a patient that I had. I do substance use disorder treatment in Bakersfield, California, which used to be the hotbed of racism in the state of California. Most of my patients don't look like me. They are not African American. And many of them have been middle to upper class who have fallen on hard times. And they do have the insignia of your patient, the bowels of hatred are somewhere close by. But when they come in for their treatment and they have to sit with me, remembering that there's some suffering behind those eyes and behind all of that facade, and opening up to them opens them up to me. And I think it's a message to all of us, and probably everyone in our audience who's had an encounter of patient care or client care, pharmacist, dentist, has had an experience like this. And it's valuable to how we go forward and teach the next crop of medical students. I want to take some questions from the audience and see whether or not they resonate with you and what we've been talking about. I'm asked to ask you, can you talk a little bit about your writing journey and what galvanized you toward this topic? And I'm going to suggest to you that a parent question to that is, how do you juggle between the practice of medicine and activism?
Wow. Yeah. So the writing journey, I have always written in a journal. And when I'm in my best form, I'm waking up in the morning and writing in a journal for a little bit, just even some pages. And that's helped me with my composing as an artist. Being an artist, being someone who expresses myself through various media has always been a part of my identity and part of what I've done. But writing the book really came out. I gave a grand rounds at UT Austin on the intersection between police violence and health. And my co-author, Raj Patel, was in the audience. He is a good friend, a dear friend. We've been friends for years. His wife, Minnie, used to be here at UCSF. And Raj heard the talk and he was driving me to the airport afterwards. And he's like, we need to write a book together. And I said, oh my God, you got to be crazy. I don't write books. And he's like, no, we absolutely need to write about this work that I've been doing with, looking at how communities are impacted in their health through issues of social oppression. And so it was really a great gift to work with Raj. He's one of the most brilliant humans I've ever met. We would wake up every morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. I have 2 young children, so I'd wake up at 3 o'clock every morning and spend 4 hours writing without interruption. And Raj and I would debate every morning at 5 o'clock. We'd get up and discuss and debate. And it was, we had been reading casually, slowly, coming up with these ideas over 3 years. But when we first submitted our proposal to our book agents in December, they were like, what the hell is decolonizing medicine? What does that mean? Like, you have to explain this to people. And then we're like, oh God, okay. So we went back and rewrote the proposal and submitted it. And the book got bought before it even went to auction on the same day that I came home from working on 15 long a stretch of days where that first Japanese cruise patient was a COVID patient. I came home and had myalgias and sore throat and headache and, fatigue. And I didn't have a fever and a cough, so I didn't get a COVID test, but I was sick for 12 days. And so the book was literally, and Raj had to go to Malawi. He was filming a documentary and he came back and then he had a fever of 104 degrees. So neither of us were tested at the time because there were no tests. That we were like, oh my God, did we start writing this book when we both had COVID? And then we wrote it through.
Well, something came out of COVID.
Yeah, so it was quite a journey. It was, and I can say as a doctor, part of it was so challenging because I had to read all this historic documents, the history of medicine, histories of how we learned about interleukin-1 and inflammation. And reckoning with the violence of Western medicine and Western science, like that actually Western science has been based upon the fractured relationships to the web of life. That you would actually, dissect a living animal alive without anesthesia, that's part of our knowing. That you would perform experiments on enslaved women, that's part of our knowing. That you would, heat a box with a rabbit in it to see how fever happens, that is part of our knowing. And so when you think about the brutality through which our knowledge of medicine has been based, that for me was really hard to contend with, like as I was diving through the book and like trying to understand like what is the knowledge system I've been learning through, and is there a better way of doing it? Is there a better way of pursuing our science, one that infuses our work with a different kind of meaning and a different kind of relationality to all the entities around us that keep us healthy and well?
Now that this book has been birthed, are you carrying twins?
Oh
Is there
God.
another book or two, triplets? What? We need more writing. Talk to us.
Well, right now I'm very much involved in the work of the Deep Medicine Circle. So this last year we started a nonprofit organization, a bunch of women, of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, to work on healing the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, story, restoration, and learning. So there's a lot of scientists and artists and activists and lawyers and doctors and healers all working together to advance a different way of doing these things. So a different way of practicing healing, a different way of telling stories. And so part of that work will be storytelling, and I will be writing there. But that work right now is just very deeply involved in getting land back for Indigenous people and growing healthy food for hungry people, because the need is so great right now, especially during this pandemic.
Well, I'm tempted to say that we need to just abandon the existing institutions and start a new medical school that's focused on deep medicine. But if we don't go to that extreme, what do you see in the future for institutionalized medicine, such as it tries to remain? Is it going to change? And if so, what will it take from us, your audience?
Yeah, I think that we're already seeing it changing. We are seeing medical students, brave Black medical students at UCSF speaking out, speaking up. And we're seeing the pushback from, meeting the demands that they're requiring for their education, that they actually want an education that is relevant to the structural disease that they're seeing and they're experiencing and they're living. And an understanding of these connections. So I think that the more medicine, does allow different kinds of people in and does learn from them, to remember our humility and that all of our learners are there to actually teach us as well, then I think that we can evolve and it will evolve. But the practice of deep medicine is not something that, that is something that doctors have to learn through participating with community, through, following the lead of those deep medicine practitioners who actually aren't doctors. They are community activists, they are community workers, they are folks who are in the streets, who are trying to, work with mutual aid arrangements to make sure everyone stays safe. So these are the practitioners of deep medicine that I've been learning from, and that are our greatest teachers. And I think that there should be simultaneous education in this work.
As a 72-year-old physician who's been practicing for 44 years, I feel quite privileged to live long enough to hear a young doctor explore those earlier phraseologies that we used to use that are the shoulders upon which this subject matter is built upon: social determinants of poor healthcare outcomes. Whether it was the political science, the sociology, the psychology, the economics, what was it? It was even the spirituality that was willing to validate the lived experience of communities who are governed by different structures. Talk a little bit about spirituality as it fits into deep medicine?
Oh gosh. So reclaiming the sacred. So
Mhm.
what has been sacred in all of our ancestries has been desecrated through colonial capitalism.
Mhm.
And so the reclamation of what is sacred is a essential part of deep medicine. Understanding that there are layers of meaning that have been stripped from us as our lives have been forced into these various arrangements of debt, various arrangements of coercion of our labor and our participation in systems of violence. And to reclaim the sacred is to find those deeper meanings and those meanings that come through orientations to the water, to the land, to the air that we breathe, which we've all become very acutely aware of. So when you have the intersecting crises of pandemic and wildfire, now we see that, when the AQI is really high, people are going to suffer worse impacts of COVID, that it's a good time to get connected with spirit and meaning about what does it mean when we damage the earth so much that we can't breathe? What does it mean when we leave 8,000 people out in the streets of San Francisco when there are 30,000 vacant hotel rooms? What does that mean about who we are as a people? How much suffering do we need to see before we say, everyone get inside, everyone, let's take care of you? That's where I think those things come up. How about for you, Ramona? How do you see that same question?
I got to tell you, I was just thinking that in 2005, I had reached a point where medicine, as I had learned it at UCSF, was not serving me in healing or helping the healing of my patient base. And I had some empirical thoughts that were more spiritual and scientific. And I decided to go to seminary at the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley, so that I could find out what was, quote, the science behind spirituality, and was there a connection between the two. Lo and behold, I learned that so much of what Western theology and spirituality is a continuum of this model of oppression, to keep the mind harnessed in a framework of thought, so that we distinguish between how we process the real world, the concrete world, and how we process that part of ourselves that is more deeply spiritual, that we find ourselves getting in touch with in the middle of the night when we can't sleep, or when we're in a deep sadness or sorrow and mother can't help us through it, daddy can't help us, our best friend can't help us through it, and we're on our knees in pain and anguish, and we find our ways to some phenomena that brings us peace. And some will say, you mean God? Well, it doesn't matter what you call it, some power greater than, not tangible necessarily, but something that centers us and takes us out of that deep pain. And so what I learned from seminary was that spirituality was available to all of us, whether we go to church or not. It's available to us in forms that do not necessarily fit, quote, the Bible, okay? It does not necessarily fit any ecumenical model for faith. But if, as our Native Americans, our indigenous population would guide us, there was something that they knew, that they felt, that they experienced, that guided them in discerning whether to go left, to go right. Imagine how shocked their senses must have been when they welcomed people who didn't look like them, only to find that they were not kind, they were not caring, but they were the danger. I say that because the spirituality behind what we're doing here is at the core from my lived experience. Have you seen that yourself in that which you've learned thus far in your journey as a physician?
Yeah, I think that spirit is and spirituality having practices that connect me with a greater meaning, and not just me, but the communities that I'm working with. So many people have different ways to encounter and engage that that spirituality. But it is a critical part of how folks, especially who are dealing with struggle, can find some solace and sustenance to move through and to take care. It was interesting. I was asked by California Native folks to come out to Standing Rock to do the medical response when the police were becoming increasingly violent out there. And when I was out there, the Lakota and Dakota grandmothers asked me to stay on and help them form some clinic to decolonize medicine, which quickly became a clinic and a farm, because they were like, well, we can't decolonize medicine without decolonizing our food. And it quickly became, well, it's not just about mind body medicine, it's about mind body spirits emotion. And so their way of weaving together and like already understanding from the beginning that the attack on the spirit for those folks who, they were the last to be enclosed in the reservations. They were, the buffalo were slaughtered in the largest genocide of mammals in human history, in the Great Plains, which led to the devastation of the ecologies between the buffalo and the people and the grasses that led to these aquifers. The largest freshwater source in the whole planet was a human-made system, as per my colleague Lila June Johnson, who's a soil scientist, a Dene soil scientist, believes that it was the management of these things together that were based in spiritual relationships, that the buffalo wasn't simply just food, it was their honored spirit relative. That the lightning and the fires that were there on the prairies weren't just, scientific phenomena, but these were things that were deeply related to meaning and how the grass would grow and how the buffalo would return, and then how the water would sink down the deep roots of the prairie grass to create this water aquifer, right? And so you have all these ways of knowing and relating that end up generating a system of health for 30,000 years. And within 3 to 4 decades, with clearing the people, clearing the buffalo, clearing the grass, bringing the plow, you have complete devastation of that ecosystem. And so it's that kind of lack of knowing, because the knowing is so limited. Just like, let's plant the seed and grow the food, instead of what is the whole picture here? The whole picture is one of deep relationship. And so when you sunder those relationships, you get ecological collapse. And that's what we're living with now. That's exactly what we're living with.
Well, Rupa, this has been a magnificent hour with you. Actually less than an hour, but hopefully we have built a population of alumni who are even more interested in what you're doing. And I suspect that many want to know how to stay in touch. Can they be in touch? How to be in touch with you? Some want to know when your next publication is coming out, but what is clear is they want to know more about deep medicine and where they fit in and what they must do now that they are not only products of the medical school as undergrads or residents who've been trained here, but also practitioners who've actually taken that baby out for a ride and perhaps found some gaps that need to be closed, strategies that need to be modified. What can they do? You've got 3 minutes.
All right. Well, they can definitely reach out to me at the UCSF, through the email if folks want to be in touch. But I would say to connect through the Deep Medicine Circle, because there's a whole community of learners and healers who are gathering around this work. Come and work at the farm with me, come and be in the soil with me and help me grow food for our communities in San Francisco who are hungry. And come learn with me alongside the Indigenous elders who are there, and learn about the land that we're on, and learn about how we can work together to create a better world that is centered around care. Come participate in the care revolution. Come understand the value of revolution and what that means, that is an act of care in a time of great challenges, that to do small little incremental reforms isn't going to get us where we need to be. in these times of great systemic challenges. And so, yeah, I'd say come visit with the Deep Medicine Circle. Come check us out there.
Well, for those of you alumni who've stayed with us throughout this, whether you're with the School of Nursing, Dentistry, Pharmacy, and of course, the School of Medicine, know that we are so glad that you joined us this evening, that you were so engaged in the topic. Many, many questions have come through. I hope we've satisfied your curiosities and covered the most important questions. We encourage you to reach out to Rupa, Dr. Marya, and know that you will be blessed. I thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. Thank you so much.